For the past 2 years, the narrative surrounding the Black Sea has been misleading. The idea that the conflict here was at a stalemate, frozen or balanced, has crumbled in real time. What's just unfolded is not a minor change, but a pivotal moment that signifies a shift so profound it cannot be understated. This is the opening of the Odessa corridor, marking the most significant strategic loss the West has suffered in this conflict. This isn't about temporary headlines or daily battlefield updates. It's about the collapse of a central assumption that has guided Western strategy from the beginning. Russia has made a move that far exceeds tactical maneuvering. It's a strategic shift that redefines the entire nature of the conflict. The opening of the Odessa corridor represents a direct strike at the economic and military heart of what remains of the Ukrainian state. It's not just about capturing a city or threatening a port. It's the beginning of a phase aimed squarely at undermining Ukraine's maritime sovereignty and, by extension, the credibility of the West. What's unfolding before us is not an improvisation, but a meticulously planned execution of a broader strategy. This analysis will not be swayed by the usual shallow commentary often seen on television. No emotional framing or recycled narratives here. We will dig into the core of this development, analyzing how this corridor was opened, why NATO is now in quiet panic, and why this move spells a looming nightmare for the alliance. Russia has effectively claimed control over the sea lanes approaching Odessa. By doing so, it has established a protected shipping corridor under its own terms, extending its operational reach deep into the Western Black Sea. This single move has altered the entire conflict's geometry. The important question now is not about how Russia executed this, but why Odessa was always the central objective. Odessa is not just another Ukrainian city. It's Ukraine's last viable deep-water port. Before the war, Odessa, along with its neighboring ports, handled the lion's share of Ukrainian exports, particularly grain and steel. These were not merely symbolic exports, they were essential goods critical to global markets. Ukrainian grain feeds vast portions of the global south, and its steel is integral to industrial supply chains across the world. Control over the northwestern Black Sea is equivalent to squeezing Ukraine's economic lifeblood. By opening this corridor, Russia has gained far more than a military advantage. It now holds the power to regulate, restrict, or allow global food flows. This transforms a regional conflict into a leverage point of global magnitude. The balance of power in the entire Black Sea basin has shifted. Now, the pressure is not just on Kyiv, but on NATO states like Romania, Bulgaria, and most crucially, Turkey, which controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This is classic choke point strategy. Control a narrow, crucial space, and you can wield disproportionate influence. The signals from NATO, emergency consultations behind closed doors, a shift away from talk of victory to a focus on stabilization, and growing unease in both Washington and Brussels tell us that NATO's leadership is confronting a military reality it has long sought to avoid. Russia retains the strategic depth necessary to concentrate forces for decisive objectives. This operation was no accident. It was the result of patient preparation. Supply lines were secured, air dominance expanded, and Ukrainian naval capabilities were systematically degraded, exposing vulnerabilities. Time and again, Western leaders underestimated the power of geography. NATO viewed Ukraine as a modern European state. Russia, on the other hand, saw it as a centuries-old security buffer on its southern border. This move shows precisely where Moscow is willing to concentrate its power, where geography, economics, and military strength intersect to create lasting leverage. But to truly understand why Odessa holds such weight, we need to look beyond the present moment. Its significance didn't begin in 2022 or with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It stretches back centuries. The roots of this conflict are deep, and recognizing this history is crucial to understanding what lies ahead. Odessa's importance wasn't a new realization sparked by the outbreak of this war. It has always been critical for Russia, deeply embedded in the country's strategic calculations. To understand why Russia always aimed in this direction, we need to rewind to the late 18th century, when the Russian Empire, after defeating the Ottoman Empire, launched the Novorossiya project under Empress Catherine the Great. This was no vague imperial desire, but a concrete geopolitical plan designed in 1794. Odessa was founded intentionally as Russia's southern gateway, a warm water port that would resolve a centuries-old strategic vulnerability. Russia had long been hindered by icebound ports in the north, limiting trade and naval influence. Odessa was built to break that constraint. From its inception, it was engineered as an empire's port, soon becoming one of Russia's most important commercial centers. By the early 19th century, it was not only economically powerful, but strategically indispensable. Odessa's role was clear. It would channel the agricultural wealth of the fertile southern steppe onto global markets, with grain flowing out and wealth pouring back in, strengthening Russia's diplomatic influence. Odessa wasn't merely a trade port, it was a naval anchor and the cornerstone of Russian power in the Black Sea. The coastline, stretching from Crimea westward toward the Danube estuary, was never an abstract ambition. It was a critical strategic goal. This continuity is key to understanding the conflict today. Every major Russian conflict, from the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War to both world wars, echoed this struggle for access to the Black Sea and control over its vital ports. Russia's pursuit of dominance in the region has shaped its military thinking for more than 2 centuries, and this continuity challenges the Western narrative that overlooks Odessa's deep historical significance. The significance of Odessa did not appear suddenly with the current conflict. It has been a consistent strategic objective for Russia, rooted in its historical experience and understanding of geography. Senior Russian commanders openly articulated the goal of securing southern Ukraine early in the war, specifically to create a contiguous land and maritime corridor. This corridor was not just to link Crimea with newly occupied territories, it was to stretch further westward, potentially connecting Russia with Transnistria, the Russian-backed region in Moldova. Contrary to how it's often portrayed, this wasn't about ideological expansion. It was cold military logic. Controlling the coastline was about securing trade routes, protecting naval assets, and ensuring strategic depth against external pressure. Without Odessa, Crimea's position remained precarious. Its naval base, once seen as Russia's southern fortress, would be vulnerable to interdiction and containment. For Moscow, this was an unacceptable risk. This brings us to a key misunderstanding in Western strategy. Western analysts failed to recognize the urgency of Odessa's importance. They viewed it as just another Ukrainian port, one that should remain open for global trade. In contrast, Russia saw it as unfinished strategic business, a vulnerability that had to be closed. Western strategists were also caught in the trap of short-term thinking, shaped by election cycles and public messaging. They failed to comprehend the long-term scale of Russia's planning. This divergence in timelines, short-term crisis management versus long-term strategic vision, explains why Russia was able to act with such patience and persistence. As the war progressed, the West became increasingly focused on the land battles in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The fight in Donbass consumed attention, resources, and political messaging, leading many to neglect the strategic importance of Odessa and the Black Sea. This miscalculation would prove decisive. While the West fixated on the ground war, Russia used its time and operational freedom to shape the coastal theater. The real center of gravity was never the land battles, it was the geoeconomic control of the Black Sea. By turning its focus away from Odessa, NATO failed to appreciate the full scope of Russian ambitions. Over time, the failure of Western strategy became more apparent. The fighting in the east drained Ukraine's best forces, leaving them trapped in a grinding war of attrition. Meanwhile, Russia had free rein to disrupt the coastal region and gradually isolate Odessa from the rest of Ukraine. The West's inability to adapt to the changing nature of the conflict allowed Moscow to methodically prepare the conditions for what we're witnessing today. The opening of the Odessa corridor was not a sudden breakthrough. It was the culmination of a carefully planned and executed strategy that combined military action with geopolitical maneuvering. The first phase of this operation wasn't a dramatic amphibious assault or a sudden military clash, as many analysts expected. Instead, it was a carefully executed squeeze. Russia focused on logistics, not immediate occupation. The goal was not to storm Odessa, but to starve it of resources, both military and economic. Precision strikes targeted Ukraine's key infrastructure rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage, and logistical nodes. The repeated targeting of bridges, particularly the Zatoka Bridge, was a clear signal of Russia's strategic intent. By crippling the rail links that connected Odessa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply corridor through Romania, Russia isolated the city. This wasn't an act of symbolic destruction. It was a calculated effort to sever Odessa's lifeline to Ukraine and to the broader West. As these strikes accumulated, Ukraine's coastal defense structure began to unravel. What had once been a defensive zone became an increasingly unsustainable logistical burden. Each new unit sent to defend the region only added to the strain on an already fragile supply chain. Odessa's ports, while physically intact, became less and less functional as Ukraine's ability to resupply them dwindled. The region could no longer sustain a prolonged defensive effort or even offensive operations. What Russia achieved wasn't the seizure of the city, it was the effective neutralization of Odessa's ability to serve as a military or economic hub. At sea, Russia's dominance also grew. Early in the war, Ukraine's naval drones had delivered some tactical successes, forcing Russia to adapt and innovate. However, these successes did not dismantle Russia's area denial strategy. The Russian fleet adjusted its posture, operating from protected anchorages and reinforcing its defenses with layered air defense systems. Most importantly, Russia expanded its anti-ship and land attack missile capabilities, pushing Ukraine's effective control of the maritime zone back toward the coastline. The result wasn't a visible blockade, it was a passive blockade, one enforced through the sheer risk of operating in the Black Sea. Commercial shipping became unviable in the face of Russian threats. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, and trade, particularly for Ukraine's critical exports, slowed to a halt. The final phase of Russia's operation came from the land. With Ukraine's attention fixed on the Donbass, Russia was able to shift its forces along the coastal sector, pushing further into the heart of the region. As Ukrainian forces became increasingly stretched, the coastal defenses weakened. Odessa and its surrounding areas were left exposed. The situation worsened as Ukrainian military priorities forced them to concentrate their best forces in the east, leaving the coast vulnerable. Ukraine's defense along the Black Sea was fragile, and Russia exploited this vulnerability. This strategic squeeze allowed Russia to effectively control the means of access to and from Odessa. The corridor now gives Moscow the ability to dictate trade in economic terms, effectively denying Ukraine up to 30% of its export revenue. Odessa, once Ukraine's economic lifeline, is now a liability. The opening of the corridor represents a turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for NATO and its credibility. It's a direct challenge to NATO's deterrence model and strategic posture, exposing a gap between Western rhetoric and actual capability. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not merely a tactical loss for Ukraine. It is a decisive moment that validates Russia's attrition-based strategy. The cumulative impact of Russia's actions goes beyond just the military front. It challenges the very assumptions that underpin NATO's involvement in this conflict. Western leaders spoke confidently about Ukraine's ultimate victory, often underestimating Russia's ability to persist and adapt. NATO's support was slow, fragmented, and, crucially, limited in scope. Weapons were delivered in small quantities and at times too late to have a strategic impact. This piecemeal approach has allowed Russia to capitalize on its superior industrial capacity and strategic patience. Russia's economy was already transitioning toward a war footing long before the West made any significant industrial adjustments. By the time NATO escalated its military support, Russia had already adapted and consolidated its position. The results are clear. Ukraine's most vital economic asset has been compromised, and the balance of power in the region has shifted. One of the most critical aspects of this shift is the failure of NATO's maritime strategy. The alliance's approach to the Black Sea was disjointed with a misguided focus on the land war in eastern Ukraine. By focusing primarily on the eastern front, NATO neglected the Black Sea's maritime and economic dimensions, assuming the conflict would be decided on land. In reality, control of the Black Sea was always the decisive factor. Russia has managed to exploit this geographic oversight, isolating Ukraine's southern coast and securing its own naval dominance in the region. This wasn't just about occupying Odessa or any specific Ukrainian port. It was about degrading Ukraine's coastal infrastructure to the point where it became impossible for Ukraine to operate on a meaningful scale. With Odessa effectively neutralized, Ukraine's ability to export vital goods like grain and steel has been severely crippled. This shift isn't just a blow to Ukraine's economy, it's a direct challenge to global food security. Russia's strategy was never about grand, sweeping offensives, it was about systematic attrition. Moscow knew that the longer the conflict dragged on, the more strain it would place on NATO's resolve and Ukraine's ability to sustain a prolonged war. By focusing on logistics and critical infrastructure, Russia wore down Ukraine's defenses and forced the West into a corner. The decision to target key supply lines and infrastructure, such as the Zatoka Bridge and rail hubs, was a strategic masterstroke. These targets were not chosen at random. They were key arteries that fed into Ukraine's military and economic lifeblood. The constant attacks on these points of access were designed to grind Ukraine's resistance to a halt without ever needing to storm Odessa itself. Furthermore, the balance of power in the Black Sea has fundamentally shifted. NATO's response has been slow and ineffective, unable to prevent Russia from gaining control over vital sea lanes. The West's failure to respond quickly enough allowed Russia to solidify its dominance over the Black Sea, making it almost impossible for Ukraine to operate any significant naval presence in the region. Russia has turned the Black Sea into a militarized zone, and the absence of NATO intervention has allowed Russia to act with impunity. Commercial shipping in the area has become unviable, and the global supply chain that relied on Ukrainian exports has been thrown into disarray. This isn't just a blow to Ukraine's economy, it's a critical hit to the global economy, especially in regions that depend on Ukrainian grain and steel. The strategic consequences of Russia's control over the Black Sea are profound. NATO, which once assumed it could contain Russia's ambitions through diplomatic pressure and limited military support, is now facing the reality of a sustained geopolitical challenge. NATO's response to the opening of the Odessa corridor has been far from decisive. There have been emergency consultations and a shift in rhetoric, but NATO has yet to put forward a coherent strategy to regain control of the situation. The alliance is grappling with the realization that it is no longer in control of the narrative or the military trajectory of this conflict. The Western approach, based on slow escalation and restrained support, has proven ineffective against a Russian strategy that is built on patience, industrial depth, and a clear understanding of geography. As Russia consolidates its control over the Odessa corridor, the implications for NATO are becoming clearer. The alliance is now facing a direct strategic challenge on its southeastern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey now find themselves on the front lines of a Russian-dominated Black Sea. The Black Sea, once seen as a relatively peripheral theater of the conflict, has now become a central zone of competition. This is a shift of monumental importance. The balance of power in this region has changed, and NATO must now decide how to respond to this new reality. The most pressing question is whether NATO can regain its footing in the region or whether Russia will continue to expand its influence unchecked. The risk of further escalation is high. NATO could be tempted to escalate the conflict by introducing more advanced weapons systems or even deploying naval assets to the region. However, such a move carries significant risks, not only for the alliance's credibility, but for the broader geopolitical stability of Europe. A direct confrontation with Russia in the Black Sea could spiral into a far more dangerous conflict with consequences that reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not the end of the conflict. It is merely the beginning of a new phase. This shift forces every NATO member to confront the reality of a strategic defeat and reevaluate their position. The coming months will be crucial in determining the direction of the conflict and the future of European security. NATO faces a difficult choice: either accept the new reality and risk further erosion of its credibility, or escalate the conflict with all the dangers that entails. The opening of the Odessa corridor is a stark reminder of the consequences of underestimating Russia's strategic capabilities and the long-term nature of this conflict. The broader implications of Russia's control over the Odessa corridor are now beginning to unfold. For NATO, the situation has escalated beyond a local conflict into a full-blown strategic challenge with far-reaching consequences. The alliance's hesitancy and fractured approach have allowed Russia to establish dominance in the Black Sea, forcing NATO into a defensive position. This reality shift has profound consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire geopolitical landscape of Europe and beyond. The Black Sea is no longer a peripheral theater of operations. It is now at the center of a strategic contest between NATO and Russia. The corridor's opening has exposed critical flaws in NATO's strategy, particularly its underestimation of Russia's ability to sustain a long-term, attrition-based approach to warfare. NATO's response, while swift in some respects, has been insufficient. The alliance was caught off guard by the persistence and methodical nature of Russia's strategy. Initially, NATO focused heavily on military aid to Ukraine, providing weapons and training to help the Ukrainian military defend itself. However, the alliance failed to provide the necessary infrastructure and logistical support to withstand the full weight of Russia's long-term strategy. The steady stream of supplies and weapons from NATO was important, but it came too slowly, often arriving after the most critical battles had been lost. As a result, Ukraine found itself in a situation where its ability to continue fighting was increasingly dependent on NATO's willingness to escalate its support. However, NATO's caution in escalating the conflict only played into Russia's hands, allowing Moscow to continue its military operations unchallenged. Russia's calculated approach, focusing on logistical pressure and infrastructure degradation rather than full-scale military assault, has proved far more effective than anticipated. By targeting critical infrastructure such as bridges, rail hubs, and ports, Russia has created a situation where Ukraine's military capabilities in the southern and coastal regions have become increasingly unsustainable. The Zatoka Bridge, which connects Odessa to the rest of Ukraine, is a prime example of this strategy. Its repeated targeting and eventual neutralization severed a vital supply route, effectively isolating the region from the rest of Ukraine and NATO's support channels. The bridges were more than just physical infrastructure. They were lifelines for Ukraine's war effort. By cutting off these connections, Russia effectively crippled Ukraine's ability to reinforce its southern defenses. As Russia consolidated its hold over the region, it also maintained dominance over the Black Sea's maritime space. The Russian fleet, despite earlier setbacks from Ukrainian drone attacks, adjusted its operations and extended its reach. Moscow did not need to fully blockade the region with warships. It simply made commercial shipping unviable. This passive blockade has had a profound effect on global trade, particularly in the Black Sea, where Ukrainian grain and steel were once major exports. The insurance costs for vessels navigating the area skyrocketed, and commercial shipping became increasingly hesitant to enter the Black Sea altogether. This strategic shift in the region has not only impacted Ukraine's economy, but also global markets. Russia's control over the sea lanes has allowed it to regulate, restrict, or even deny global food flows, giving it a lever of power that extends far beyond regional borders. The longer Russia maintains control over the Odessa corridor, the more the strategic balance will shift in its favor. NATO's inability to decisively intervene has allowed Russia to establish a foothold in the region, and the alliance now faces a growing credibility gap. The diplomatic rhetoric coming from Washington and Brussels has shifted, reflecting growing unease as the reality of the situation sinks in. NATO no longer talks about outright victory for Ukraine, but instead focuses on stabilization, signaling a major shift in strategy. This change in tone indicates that NATO leadership is coming to terms with the fact that Russia has seized a major strategic advantage. The alliance must now confront the consequences of this shift and decide whether to escalate the conflict to regain control or accept the new reality and adapt its strategy accordingly. The pressure is mounting on NATO's frontline states, particularly Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Romania and Bulgaria now share a militarized maritime border with Russia, while Turkey, as the gatekeeper of the Bosporus and Dardanelles under the Montreux Convention, finds itself in a precarious position. Turkey has long balanced its NATO obligations with pragmatic engagement with Moscow, but with Russia now controlling the Black Sea's northern third, Ankara's leverage has been significantly weakened. The Bosporus and Dardanelles are no longer the gateways to a secure NATO-controlled Black Sea. Instead, they have become choke points in a conflict that NATO can no longer manage alone. Turkey's internal balancing act will be further complicated by this shift in power. NATO will need to provide more substantial support to its frontline states, but this could come at a significant cost. The strain on NATO's resources is already evident, as the alliance is stretched thin by multiple crises around the world. Romania and Bulgaria will likely demand permanent NATO reinforcements, but such a commitment may be difficult to fulfill without significant political and economic costs. The Western military-industrial complex is already under strain, and NATO's ability to respond effectively to Russia's strategic move will be determined by the alliance's capacity to sustain long-term operations in a region that is becoming increasingly contested. The economic consequences of Russia's control over the Odessa corridor are devastating. Odessa was Ukraine's last remaining deep-water port, handling a significant portion of the country's exports, including vital grains and steel. With Odessa neutralized, Ukraine faces a severe economic setback, losing up to 30% of its export revenue. This loss not only undermines Ukraine's ability to finance its war effort, but also weakens its ability to maintain public services and sustain its economy in the long term. The global impact is just as severe. Ukrainian grain has been a critical stabilizing force in global markets, particularly in the global south. By controlling access to these vital exports, Russia can use its position as a lever to influence food security around the world. Ukraine now faces a stark choice. It can attempt to hold out, relying on land-based trade routes that are vulnerable and inefficient, or it can acknowledge the new strategic reality and seek a way to negotiate with Russia. The latter option seems unlikely, given the political pressure and the stakes involved, but the former is increasingly unsustainable. The corridor has effectively neutralized Ukraine's maritime economy, and the prospect of a successful counteroffensive to regain control of Odessa seems remote. The opening of the Odessa corridor marks a dramatic turning point in this conflict, and it forces NATO to confront uncomfortable truths about its role and capabilities in the war. The alliance now faces a strategic defeat that cannot be ignored. The shift in the balance of power in the Black Sea is not a temporary setback. It is a fundamental realignment that will shape the trajectory of the war and the broader geopolitical landscape for years to come. As Russia solidifies its control over Odessa and the surrounding region, NATO must grapple with the reality that its initial strategy focused on slow escalation and restrained military support has failed. The shift from a narrative of Ukrainian victory to one of stabilization is a clear acknowledgement of this failure. One of the most striking lessons from this shift is the reality that geography and logistics have ultimately determined the outcome in the Black Sea. NATO underestimated the importance of the Black Sea as a critical theater of operations. While the West focused on the land battles in the East, Russia was quietly positioning itself to dominate the southern coast. The control of Odessa is not just a tactical victory for Russia, it is a strategic triumph that has shifted the entire geopolitical calculus. Russia's ability to disrupt Ukrainian trade and restrict global food flows is a game changer, turning a regional conflict into a lever of global influence. The West, on the other hand, has failed to match Russia's strategic depth, and now it faces the consequences of that failure. The impact of Russia's control over Odessa extends beyond Ukraine, affecting global food security, energy flows, and the stability of neighboring NATO countries. Romania and Bulgaria now face the reality of a militarized maritime border with Russia, while Turkey is forced to navigate a more precarious situation in the Black Sea. NATO's ability to maintain unity and resolve in the face of these new challenges will be tested like never before. The alliance must decide whether to escalate the conflict further, risking direct confrontation with Russia, or to accept the new reality and adapt its strategy to a situation it never fully anticipated. The opening of the Odessa corridor is also a reminder that strategic patience, industrial mobilization, and long-term thinking often win in geopolitical conflicts. Russia's ability to maintain focus on its long-term goals, despite the challenges and setbacks, has paid off. The West, on the other hand, remains mired in short-term thinking, driven by election cycles, public messaging, and political pressures that limit its ability to think beyond the next immediate crisis. This mismatch in strategic thinking has allowed Russia to exploit NATO's weaknesses and has placed the alliance in a position where its credibility is increasingly in doubt. For NATO, the future is uncertain. The alliance must now confront the reality that it has failed to prevent the opening of the Odessa corridor and that the balance of power in the Black Sea has shifted irreversibly. The question is no longer whether the situation can be contained, but how NATO will respond to this new strategic reality. The West must decide whether to escalate the conflict, risking a broader confrontation with Russia, or to accept that its influence in the Black Sea has been severely diminished. Both options carry significant risks, and neither guarantees success. The strategic defeat in Odessa is a stark reminder of the importance of long-term planning, the need for strategic depth, and the critical role that geography plays in shaping global power dynamics. Russia's victory in the Black Sea has exposed critical flaws in Western strategy and left NATO facing a dilemma that may take years to resolve. The next phase of this conflict will determine not only the future of Ukraine, but also the stability of Europe and the credibility of NATO as a collective security organization. As the world watches the situation unfold, the broader consequences of the Odessa corridor will continue to reverberate across the globe. The opening of this corridor is not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of a new, more dangerous phase. Whether this moment becomes a lesson learned or a precedent for future confrontations will shape the balance of power for a generation. For NATO, the time for action is now. The decisions made in the coming months will have far-reaching consequences, and the world is waiting to see how the alliance will respond to the challenge before it. The stakes have never been higher.